Everything rolling. And I'm good when
Good
you
to
are.
go. All right.
Okay.
Good morning. My name is David Hankey, and my research is on the predictive value of cornerback prospects in the National Football League. So my research question is, how can NFL scouts more accurately predict the rate of success when assessing college cornerback prospects? Now, before I get into everything, I want to look over some quick terminology in the NFL. First, the cornerback position is a very difficult position in the NFL. It's a small, very athletic position where they're tasked with guarding wide receivers on offense. Their goal is to either break up passing plays or stop the offense by making tackles. Next, there are a few relevant NFL terms I also want to go over. The first one is Pro Bowl. A Pro Bowl is a fan-voted event in which players are selected from either conference and they're seen as the best players in the NFL. Next, All-Pro is very similar to Pro Bowl, except it's every player in the league, so it's just the best player at every position in the National Football League. Next, an interception is a box score statistic where a defender catches a ball from an offensive player, which is a turnover. And lastly, a pass defended is just like an interception, but instead of catching the ball, they hit it out of the air or hit it to the ground. Next, the NFL Combine is an event where 300 of the best college players come to show their athleticism and participate in interviews with NFL teams. The drills which I'm going to be looking over in this research are the 40-yard dash, which is an event where players run 40 yards as fast as possible, bench press, where players bench press 225 pounds for the most reps as possible, vertical jump and broad jump, where players try to jump as high as they can and jump as far as they can, the 20-yard shuttle, where players run 5 directions one way, 10 in the other, and then 5 back. And then the 3-cone, where players run in an L formation to test their agility. Now, going into my background, I want to go over how I came up with this question in the first place. Over the summer, I looked at many research studies on cornerbacks and NFL Combine. So I wanted my topic to surround the NFL Combine, defensive backs, the NFL Draft, and NFL success. My biggest problem was, how do you define success in the National Football League? As this is a very opinionated topic where success could be something to somebody, but it could be completely different to somebody else. The way I was able to figure this out was through career approximate value. Now, career approximate value is made by Doug Dryden, who created Pro Football Reference, which is the NFL statistics website. He defined it as an attempt to put a single number on the seasonal value of a player at any position of any year. Now, this simply means that if you play well during an NFL season, your career AV will improve. So the best players will have the highest AV score, while players who do not do well in the NFL have a low AV score. Now, with knowing what success is, I can finally ask, how can NFL scouts more accurately predict the rate of success when assessing cornerback prospects? Now, there are a few foundational studies which I base my methodology off of. First, predictive value of National Football League scouting combine and future performance of running backs and wide receivers was a study by Sarah Teramoto, where he looked at wide receivers and running backs' combine performances and compared that with their NFL statistics. An example of what they found was they found 40-yard dash had a very good correlation with yards per rush. So the players who are very fast also had a good average yards per carry. So the conclusion I found off that is there are correlations between NFL statistics and combine performance. Next, a study by David Hedlund, which is the performance of future elite players at the National Football League Scouting Combine, looked at players who did not make Pro Bowls, players who made Pro Bowls, and players who were all pro, and looked at their combine performance. For cornerbacks, he found that players who are heavy and players with good vertical jumps were more likely to become all pros. So this study showed that there are correlations between positive combine measurements and NFL success. Lastly, a study by Vincent Richardson, which showed 50% of NFL first-round picks are busts, showed a chart which has all players in their first-round draft rating. So, when looking at this chart, you can see that defensive backs have the lowest rate of success when being drafted. And this was just shown by players who average an average AV of 7 or more a year. So aside from tight end, which is a player which is not very drafted very often drafted in the first round, defensive backs have the lowest rate of success in the NFL. So, through this, I found two gaps in research. I found that cornerbacks are very underrepresented in studies. Most of the studies were done on offensive players, and there were barely any done on defenders, let alone cornerbacks. The other one was that their cornerbacks had a very low rate of success when being drafted. As you saw in the study before, cornerbacks have the lowest rate of success over a few years in the NFL. Therefore, my goal of this research is to fill this gap by finding correlations between college success and athleticism in the NFL, determining which quantitative factors are most important in predicting cornerbacks, and overall, I want to improve the rate of success of cornerbacks when they're drafted into the NFL, since that mark was so low. So, my initial hypothesis is that the NFL Combine will be a very predictable format for cornerbacks. As I said earlier, the cornerback position is very athletic based. So I think that players who are athletic will more likely perform better in the NFL. I believe that the most important drills are the 40-yard dash and the 3-cone, which are drills which look at top speed and agility. And lastly, I believe that college success wouldn't really correlate to NFL success. Because with cornerbacks, oftentimes when a player is very good, they won't get many great statistics because they're just not thrown at. Now, we're going to look into my methodology to see how I answered this question. So, I did a correlational quantitative study where I collected the 2005 to 2009 NFL draft classes for cornerbacks. And then I looked at their statistics from college, the NFL, and the NFL Combine. And I looked to find correlations between those measurements and career approximate value. The website I used was Pro Football Reference and College Football Reference. As I mentioned earlier, this was created by Doug Dryden, who also created career approximate value, and this is the NFL statistics page for important relevant box score statistics. An example of a page would be right here, as it shows every statistic you could possibly need. It shows, for example, games played, games started, interceptions, tackles, the position they played, the teams they played for, and the amount of time they played. So, with this data, I was able to determine which players were successful and which were not based on their career approximate value, and I broke it down into 5 groups. The highest group was All-Pro. Every player in this group was an All-Pro at one time, and their career approximate value was extremely high. I then broke it down to Pro Bowl players, who also made Pro Bowls every single year, and then successful players who had high career approximate values, but were not in that threshold of being Pro Bowlers or All-Pro players. Average players, which is where most of the players fell. Most players who started for multiple years had a career approximate value at about 21 to 40. And then below average players, which were players who did not play that much in the NFL or had very, very short careers. So, with my data collection tool, I would collect every player from each draft class, and I would break it down into 3 sections. I would break it down into their NFL statistics to show whether they are successful or not, and then I would look at their college statistics to see how they performed in college, and then I would break it down into their NFL Combine. This is an example of an NFL Combine page. You have all the players, you have their approximate value, and then you have all their statistics, which are given right here. And then, once I had all those statistics, I used those 5 groups to break down the players based off their career approximate value, and then averaged out how they performed in each event. So for example, when I was looking at the NFL statistics of these players, I broke it down in between each group of players. And for example, you could see that an All-Pro player had an average career span of 11 years, played about 150 games, and had very high statistics when compared to other groups. So, how does this research develop my conclusion? This research since it's a correlational quantitative study, I was able to look at many factors. If I was doing a more short type of study, I wouldn't be able to look at many different aspects of cornerback playing. I looked at 5 years of draft classes, which is about 130 players, which gave me a large enough sample size which I believe I could make a fair assumption based off cornerbacks. And lastly, career approximate value is a concrete way to predict whether a player was successful or not. that takes the whole opinion out of players, as now I know which players were successful and which ones weren't. Now, we're going to look at my results of my study. I'm breaking it down into two ways. I'm breaking it into physical measurements, which are just athleticism, and the statistical performance, which goes into accolades and college performance. First, when looking at the 40-yard dash versus career proximate value, you can see that there's a clear trend between being fast in the NFL and being a good cornerback. The slowest group of players ran about a 4.45 second 40-yard dash, while the fastest players ran a 4.38. And even though that does not seem like a very big difference, when playing football, the smallest amount of speed can make a large difference in a player's game. Next, looking at the three cone, there was a very big gap between the best players and the worst players. Now, the best players, they had a much faster three-cone drill, which shows that they're much more agile than the other players, as well as being faster. Looking at broad jump, it's a similar type of trend. The players who were at the top, who were all pro players, jumped much farther than the players at the bottom. And this trend continued with vertical jump, as the players who were the best in the NFL jumped higher than the players who were not as good in the NFL. And lastly, a different type of physical trait is weight. So not only were these players who are all pro more athletic than other players in the NFL, they're doing it at higher weight. So they are heavier, but they're also more athletic at the same time. So the conclusions that can be made off of this is that there are 4 types of drills which are most important in the NFL. The speed and explosive drills, lower body explosive drills, and then change of direction drills and strength drills. Now, looking at statistical performance, you can see that in college, players with the highest amount of interceptions also play the least amount of time. It takes 3 years for a player to be eligible to be drafted into the NFL. So 3 years is the minimum amount of time they can play. So as you can see, the all-pro players, they played the least amount of time, but also had the most interceptions by almost 1.5 interceptions. Also, something I found while also looking at this is that most of the Pro Bowl players were picked early in the draft. This shows that even though cornerbacks are very difficult to predict, NFL scouts are still doing their job fairly well. They're picking players who are the best, often first, and before every other player. So the conclusions I made out of this was that the best players were more productive over a less time in college. And not only that, is that the best players tend to be picked first in the draft. And although that may seem obvious, that's a very good insight to look at because it still shows that scouts are doing their jobs. Now, we're going to look at my conclusion. So, going back to the question, I was asking, how can NFL scouts more accurately predict the rate of success when assessing college cornerback prospects? Now, the answer to that is indicators of future NFL success. As I mentioned earlier with my statistics, I was able to draw some conclusions based off of my results. Now, I found that higher body explosivity, high acceleration and top speed, quick change in direction, and being a standout college performer were the most important aspects of being a good college or NFL player. Now, these players, not only were they extremely athletic, but they performed very well in college. And the implications of this is that scouts can use these indicators combined with their qualitative assessments of cornerbacks, which is just looking at things such like their form, the way they play, their footwork, and their personality. And then hopefully this should improve the number of successful cornerbacks being drafted in the NFL, or at least improve the rate they are successfully picked. Now, I'm going to reflect on my research process and see any flaws or any implications which are done through this research. So first, looking at my initial hypothesis, I was correct that the NFL Combine is extremely predictable for cornerbacks. But where I was wrong was determining which variables were most important. See, I predicted that the 40-yard dash and the three-cone drill were the most important variables. I was very wrong in this prediction. What actually was the biggest predictor was weight. Weight was the biggest predictor, as there was such a large gap between the best players and the worst players, in that not only were they very athletic, but they're doing it at a higher weight. And lastly, college statistics were very, very important in predicting NFL success. As I mentioned earlier, the best players had the most interceptions in the lowest amount of time, meaning that college statistics were very important. Now, I'm going to go over limitations of my research. The biggest limitation is that I am looking at quantitative stats, which is basically just athleticism. Obviously, in the NFL, athleticism is not the most important. It's very important, but it does not paint a full picture of a player. So as you can see right here, I'm comparing two players with completely different AV scores. Darrelle Revis was the best player I had in the 2005 to 2009 classes. He had a career approximate value of 101, which is extremely high, while Courtney Brown was a late round pick who had a career approximate value of 2. If you look at their combine performance, Courtney Brown is almost as athletic as Darrelle Revis, aside from three-cone drill where there's a big gap. So ideally, if athleticism was everything, then Courtney Brown and Darrelle Revis should have the same career approximate value. But that's obviously not the case because skill is still very important in the NFL, and that's a qualitative factor which can be improved upon. Also, not only are cornerbacks becoming more athletic, but wide receivers are also becoming more athletic. As you can see in the 2018 average combine results of wide receivers versus cornerbacks, wide receivers are just as athletic as cornerbacks, but they're also bigger. They're playing at a bigger size, and they also have the advantage of knowing what the offense is going to do, rather than defensive backs and cornerbacks who just have to predict what they do and play accordingly to them. Lastly, for future research, there are 3 things which I believe are very important in furthering improving this gap. First, you need to quantify skill. Now, skill, as I mentioned earlier, is such like footwork, personality, the way they play, and their instincts. So, if there was a method to quantify this skill, I believe there would be a much higher way to predict cornerback success. Next, as time goes on, you'll be able to use more recent years. The reason I picked 2005 to 2009 was because they're the most recent year where every cornerback selected retired. So looking into more years, you have more players you can use who played a more modern game to today's NFL. And lastly, you can add more factors. I only looked at factors which included college performance and NFL performance, as well as NFL Combine. If you add other things such as interviews, injury history, and personal aspects of the players, there could be much more ways to predict cornerbacks. Now, this is very important because in order for the NFL to improve as a whole, you need to have great playing. So having cornerbacks be more predictive in the NFL is great for the business and great for the league as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
All right, David, we'll start over here. How did your review of the methods used by scholars in the field inform your selection of a research method aligned with your research question?
So when I was looking over my research, I believe that the biggest influence which it had on me was the one by David Hedlund, where he compared NFL Combine against Pro Bowl and All-Pro players. It kind of set the basis of what I wanted to do with my research, because I wanted to look at successful players and how they performed in the NFL Combine. So using that study and kind of replicating it into mine, but doing it my own way, was very beneficial in me trying to find a conclusion and solve my research question.
Thank you.
How does your new understanding address a gap in the scholarly conversation?
So my initial gap was that there was not enough representation for cornerbacks and that there was a very low rate of cornerback success. So finding indicators which do predict cornerback success would kind of just shorten the gap, and then over time with more research, this gap could be shortened as there are more cornerback research done and there are a lot of predictive factors for cornerbacks.
If you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
So in my research process, I initially wanted to create an algorithm which could efficiently predict cornerback success. I believe I spent too much time focusing on that and didn't spend enough time focusing on my research as a whole. So if I were to do it again, I would instead not focus as much as on the algorithm, but instead use more years and more players to create a bigger sample size so I can make even better predictions.